Queensland state election is happening on the 31st of October. If you turn 18 before that date, you'll need to enrol to vote to have your say about Queensland's future. To enrol to vote, visit aec.gov.au.
Good morning and welcome to the second episode of Queensland Votes. I'm Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer. I'm the Director of the Policy Innovation Hub here at Griffith University. It's wonderful to be with you again to think of everything that's happened in the Queensland State Election 2020 in the second week. This week we have Jenny Menzies and we also have Anne Tiernan joining me to discuss week 2 of the Queensland election. And now let's hear from Professor of Politics here at Griffith University, Peter van Onselen.
We know that the contest on the 31st of October is likely to be close, and in that context, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, has, as predicted, made his way to Queensland to campaign for the LNP. He's largely done it turning up and discussing federal issues and discussing the federal budget. He's also turned his attention to the last federal election campaign, where the state of Queensland really did deliver him the election victory that few expected. He's reminding voters up in Queensland about some of the Bill Shorten policies from that campaign. It remains to be seen, though, whether that will really work for the state LNP. Traditionally, voters do delineate between state and federal political issues, although not always. And Scott Morrison is building momentum, he hopes, for his LNP colleagues around some of those federal issues that also relate back to the budget. And given the context of some of the clashing between the Queensland Labor Premier and the Liberal Prime Minister at the federal level, there may be a chance that those issues do in fact overlap. But the LNP and the LNP leader, she's had a world of problems in week 2 of the campaign, with a lot of the scuttlebutt that some of the issues that she's faced criticism on have developed because of internal tensions within the LNP. And what's most risky about this is not necessarily the issues themselves, but if a perception builds that there is instability internally, that might see Queensland voters sticking with the devil they know on polling day. Because we've seen ever since the amalgamation of the LNP with the Nationals and Liberals coming together into one party, there have been internal fractures and internal tensions there. And the risk, of course, as I say, is that all of these issues that she's faced bubble into that perception and cause difficulties. You can bet that the Labor Party is going to continue to look and campaign in that space. Undoubtedly, borders continues to be a significant issue, but as we work our way deeper into the campaign, state issues and some of the economic issues at the state level are likely to become more and more dominant, one would assume. I'll be back in week 3 to analyse exactly where things are at as we draw ever closer to polling day.
Now let's have a think about week 2 in the Queensland election, and let's go through what was a week where everyone seemed quite distracted, frankly, and a week which was quite thin on policy announcements. So let's first think about the visit of Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Last week we speculated whether he would in fact give that bump in the polls to the LNP and increase visibility of Deb Frecklington. Didn't quite go as planned, did it?
Oh, I think in a way it wasn't a bad outcome for Deb Frecklington. I think because of what happened with the integrity issue that arose during the week, he actually did kind of run some cover for her. I think the spotlight would have been much more heavily on her if he hadn't been up there and the media pack spent a lot of time following him when he went off on his separate selling the budget trip, and I think it did give her a bit of cover.
Yes, that's a good point, which brings us beautifully to why she needed cover. And do you have views on Scott Morrison's visit? Do you think it did what they needed it to do?
Yeah, well, look, I think as Jenny said, Sue, fresh from the budget announcements and the major expenditure announced in the federal budget by Josh Frydenberg the week before, that provided some policy cover. And of course, he's just a much more experienced campaigner than Deb Frecklington, who was very much on the back foot. And then, of course, there was a lot of speculation about whether some of the revelations about whether she was in breach of campaign donations by meeting with property developers that came up, and whether those had actually been leaked by her own party, opened up the question of this deeply problematic LNP merger that is of huge frustration to the federal party, of course. Yes. So, you know, I think some of that tension was a distraction. But, you know, Morrison keeps going. That's the thing about him. He doesn't take a backward step. So I think Jenny's right, that going around and connecting in those ways was probably really important. I mean, what was interesting was
Peter Van Osselen, though, that we don't know whether that translated into actual polls or votes.
No, I'm sure that's right. But I mean, you know, for me, what's interesting is where they're spending their time. Yeah. So getting up there in those very marginal seats around Townsville, getting up there in and around Rockhampton and making, making all sorts of policy announcements is, I think, what the Prime Minister was here to do, and did it pretty successfully. There was one event, though, wasn't there, where he went off without her, and then that's raised a whole question of its own. So, you know, it's so hard to be an opposition in this kind of context when the government's been dominant through its handling of the COVID crisis.
That's right, and then they found there was a case in Townsville, a COVID case in Townsville, which was maybe not the focus that they were looking for, but brought that very front of mind. I mean, to my view, it did look like he was well received where he went, especially on the Gold Coast, and we had the Premier also on the Gold Coast. But this week's all been about regional Queensland, with lots of announcements and so much high vis. My goodness.
Political parties like to control media conversations, particularly during election campaigns. However, sometimes they lose control of the narrative and resort to desperate measures to shift attention. One such strategy is known as throwing a dead cat on the table, also known as a dead cat strategy. The term describes a manoeuvre to regain control by throwing a more shocking issue into the mix, distracting people from the topic the party wants to avoid. Everyone becomes fixated on the dead cat, and the issue that was causing the party grief will fade into the background. This kind of diversionary tactic becomes critical in the heightened atmosphere of an election campaign, but it only works if the right elements are in place to shift the opponents from their preferred ground to your ground. Firstly, the dead cat must be a topic that is irresistible to the media, something tantalising, a negative that will appeal to their audiences. Secondly, it must also be something of general interest and easily understandable. And thirdly, it can't be done by the leader, but instead should be offered up by a more junior minister or a shadow minister. While a dead cat strategy might be the best way to avoid debate to derail the opponent's momentum, it can also be risky. Voters can be put off by negative campaigning, and as much as you might shift the focus in the short term, we never know when a dead cat might be thrown in your direction.
This has been a week in politics both in New South Wales and Queensland that have been dominated by this nexus between money and access to political power. It's a situation in Queensland where all cash donations to political parties by property developers has been banned. But of course, there's always these lingering questions about who gets to hang out at a fancy dinner with the politician of their choice. It's arisen for Deb Frecklington, it's also arisen for Yvette Darth this week. And of course, it's a big issue for Gladys Berejiklian. I've found it very interesting that a lot of Queensland papers have been covering Gladys in the middle of a Queensland election campaign. So if I could come to my experts, what is this lingering problem that we have around integrity in relation to money and politics and access to power?
It's interesting because there's such a long history of this issue in Queensland since the 1989 election, the post-Fitzgerald election. I think there's a couple of things at play here. A lot of it is about political positioning and perception. So you want to leave the perception that your opponent has maybe been up to something dodgy. So there's one kind of stream of stuff that happens and it might get referred to the CCC or whatever during the campaign, and after the campaign there's nothing to be seen there. So it's a kind of a manoeuvre during the campaign. But then we have these ongoing issues that you talked about there, about the cash for access, the ongoing kind of relationship of the LNP with property developers. And there's been a lot of legislative change over the years. You kind of think we've moved on from it, but as the legislation changes, these issues keep popping up. So I think you have to kind of draw the distinction between a perception that a political party is trying to make about its opposition and what is a legitimate issue.
And I think maybe at the moment, do people really want to see pollies off at fancy dinners on the on the river. It's not a good look, I don't think. But
well, I just felt the collective head swivel south earlier in the week after the revelations about Gladys Berejiklian, and which I think people were genuinely shocked by, and of course the evidence that Daryl Maguire gave at that very public hearing earlier in the week, brought us back to the land sale at Badger East Creek. Now, corruption issues in Queensland have a long history going back to the Fitzgerald inquiry, but they go back to the Rum Corps in New South Wales, and just this extraordinary spectacle of the interrelationship between property, members of parliament, vested interests, the misuse of public money, and who knew what when, I think actually is very damaging all round for politics altogether. But integrity questions dogged the Palaszczuk government in ways that they haven't for Labor governments really in the post-Fitzgerald era. And so it's been a quite interesting opportunity for them to kind of turn the tables, I think. And it revealed the gap, I think, quite clearly between Deb Frecklington's office and the party machine, and that's because the party tried to replace her as leader in June. So this kind of divide between the parliamentary wing and the political wing and the party organisation is really, really difficult.
it's definitely the motto for the week if you're a female Conservative politician in Australia with friends like these.
The issue of employment is front and centre in the minds of many. The COVID-19 economic shutdown saw many Queenslanders lose their jobs, but even before the slowdown there were still large numbers out of work. Many communities have seen increasing concentrations of unemployment, with local communities witnessing declining local economies, the presence of social issues and a lack of community resilience. The problems are statewide, but more concentrated in some electorates. In the electorates of Woodridge in southeast Queensland, unemployment was already around 13% prior to the economic slowdown, with youth unemployment sitting at 26%. While in the Fraser Coast electorate of Maryborough, unemployment was 11%, with youth unemployment sitting at 23%. But these figures are only the tip of the iceberg. In electorates such as these, we see high rates of intergenerational unemployment, low educational achievement, high rates of financial stress, along with poor health and other social outcomes. Electorates like Woodridge and Maryborough require joined-up solutions, with jobs being front and centre. While announcements about infrastructure spending and the employment opportunities they create are welcome, they are unlikely to result in a jobs bonanza. The jobs challenge requires fresh thinking. Whichever party forms government in Queensland following the October 31st election should immediately lobby the federal government to work with state and local governments to implement a job guarantee scheme. Such a scheme would include guaranteeing a job for everyone who wants to work, paid at minimum wage with the usual entitlements of leave and superannuation. The jobs created would be locally focused and designed in consultation with local communities, ensuring ownership of the scheme and a greater chance of success. In the short term, Queensland should establish a state-funded scheme, especially focused on communities most in need. Introducing such a scheme would put Queensland at the forefront both nationally and internationally in addressing the social and economic malaise associated with joblessness. A program like this would move the state towards the kind of just and sustainable transition that Queenslanders deserve.
Welcome back to the couch, and now we're talking about how this data in the Queensland election affects the kinds of policies we should be seeing from all the parties, and are we seeing the right kind of approach to job creation? Look, that data is very depressing, the amount of Queenslanders in distress and where they all are. What should we be seeing around policy approaches to this issue?
It's interesting because Scott talked about a more place-based approach, and that's been done in Queensland before in post 1998, a community renewal program that actually did a lot of that, went into places like Townsville, Logan, Ipswich, and did a whole lot of concentrated projects around getting more employment, more industry. So I think that's a way to go. But I think there's a longer economic history of Queensland that data really kind of shows up. Yeah. So we have, the state has always struggled to be economically viable. So it's kind of an El Dorado state where you have, you find gold and suddenly everything's okay, and then it's resources or it's sheep or tourism. But it's always been the kind of export-oriented, trade-exposed industries. So those people in all those depressed areas are the ones that are incredibly exposed to that. So China's going to cut off the coal, the sugar price drops, whatever. So you can understand why they're a bit kind of febrile about the way that they vote, because they're at the forefront of any shift, a change in the dollar or whatever. So we've never managed to be able to grow sustaining industries that aren't exposed into those world markets and that will kind of keep those populations viable.
And yet, did you see the two leaders leading us in that direction this week? I saw a lot of return to history, trains and...
I thought it was kind of like a 1970s campaign, and it surprised me, particularly with a kind of high levels of unemployment, because all the high vis and all the jobs that I'm talking about were in resources and places like that are notoriously low employment industries. So the high employment industries in Queensland are the service sectors, tourism, tertiary education, places like that. And our political leaders should understand those basics about Queensland. So I'm not quite sure why they're so fixated on such a narrow range of jobs for mainly blue-collar male workers.
It's very strange. It's like, get out of the hard hats.
Well, we've noticed this in the federal election campaign too, didn't we, Jenny? You know, this obsession with the economy as it was, rather than the economy as it is and emerging and changing, and this was even before COVID. I mean, the Queensland economy was very weak. The Australian economy actually was very weak coming into the current crisis. But, you know, it's like the leaders aren't engaging with the data, and it's why we're so interested in the differentiation and what's happening for cohorts in these electorates. You know, it really matters, and it's really showing up. So, you know, I think, you know, I really agree with what you've said, Jenny, about those kinds of the volatility, the inherent volatility of a not as diverse as it ought to be economy. But, you know, where the jobs are, health, human services, the caring sector, all those essential workers that have, you know, been seen through this pandemic as being so important, they actually can't fill those roles in regional Queensland, and that fundamentally comes back to human capital. We've heard almost nothing about skills development and human capital. We've had a lot of, you know, focus on industries that haven't actually been that disrupted, you know, particularly infrastructure and construction. So it's just kind of confounding, really, and the federal government's quite visceral reaction to the #CredibleWomen campaign, you know, is really surprising, given, you know, it's pre-selected, so the LNP has pre-selected some really potentially quite interesting female candidates in seats like Whitsunday, Palmerston, where these high rates of youth unemployment in particular and intergenerational employment, you know, with the demise of tourism, with the tourism dollar just kind of falling off a cliff. Now, and so why I think it's important to kind of focus on those spatial differences. There's something very interesting going on in places like Toowoomba and that region, which is actually going pretty well. And we can see that also in the data. And so keeping agriculture moving, doing those the logistics and supply chain opportunities of the Wellcamp Airport and so on, you know, you're really starting to see the benefit of that. Look, some of the unemployment data, I think, that came out on Thursday, Cameron Dick, the Queensland Treasurer, was very keen to say, oh, look, Victoria's being propped up by JobKeeper. It's still a bit early for us to tell, really, I think, until the next quarter.
And I think it's fascinating that the data that the leaders have does not seem to be reflecting in what they're doing. So maybe that's why it hasn't been resonating with people, as a bit of a lack of energy around some of these.
Or a lack of policy work is the other potential explanation.
A state election is happening soon.
Seats have been won and lost by only a few votes.
We have the power to shape Queensland's future.
Enrol today. It only takes a few minutes.
No party hoping to govern Queensland can rely on winning seats in the southeast only. They have to win seats in the regions as well if they want to form government. So what makes the region so important? Well, Queensland's the only mainland Australian state where more people live outside the capital city than within it. It used to be said that Queensland was composed of two very distinct demographies, born of very different geographies, industries and civic cultures. Coastal Queensland and the rural interior, or more simply, Brisbane versus the bush, or at least the southeast and the rest. In 2020, we might say there are actually 6 Queenslands. These include Brisbane City, the Brisbane Fringe, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, the Eastern Provinces and Western Rural. Now each of these 6 regions has its own demographic profile and each demonstrates its own peculiar voting behaviour. The first of these regions is Brisbane, where we find 21 seats, and we say the limits of Brisbane are around 20 kilometres from the Brisbane CBD. A second region is the Brisbane Fringe, where we find 19 additional seats in such satellite cities and shires as Logan in the south, Ipswich in the west, Moreton Bay in the north, and Redlands in the east. A third region is the Gold Coast, where we find 11 seats between Logan City and the New South Wales border. A fourth region is the Sunshine Coast, where we find 9 seats between Moreton Shire and Gympie. A fifth region is the Western Rural Zone, where we find 12 seats, some of which are actually larger than many European nations. And these run westward, including some that run all the way to the Northern Territory or the South Australian border. And that leaves the last region, the Eastern Provinces, where we find 21 seats that run up the eastern seaboard, from Gympie all the way to Cape York. So what can we expect to see in each of these Queenslands? Well, we can expect little movement in Brisbane or the Brisbane Fringe. The LNP has an uphill task if it wants to make headway across Greater Brisbane, simply because Labor holds just 6 seats there on margins under 6 percentage points. Labor Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk has been well received across Queensland for her management of the COVID-19 pandemic, and with recent opinion polling also telling us Labor is regarded as a better economic manager, Labor might actually pick up seats across Greater Brisbane. The Gold Coast region offers a similar story. Labor holds only 1 seat there, the ultra-marginal Gavin, and that seat would fall over if border closures emerge as the Gold Coast overriding sentiment. But given the swing against the LNP in this year's Currumbin by-election, we also know that LNP leader Deb Frecklington is struggling to find electoral traction on the Gold Coast. The LNP holds 5 of its 10 Gold Coast seats by margins under 5%. So it's possible a gratitude vote over Labor's tough border policy could force a couple of LNP seats actually to fall Labor's way. The Sunshine Coast will probably see even less movement. The LNP holds 8 of the 9 seats there. Noosa is held by a popular independent. But the ultra-marginal Palmerston could easily fall Labor's way too. Once again, we'll expect little movement across the western rural regions, where we find 12 seats. Labor holds just 1 there, and that's Ipswich West, not far from Brisbane, and that's held by a substantial 9% margin. The Katter Party hold just 1 there, and they'll probably hang on to it quite easily. Fortunately for the LNP, only 2 of those seats, Lockyer and Toowoomba North, are technically marginal. That means the state's most volatile and therefore interesting region is found across the 21 seats in the Eastern Provinces. There, Labor could lose its majority and government if it loses just 3 North Queensland seats, Townsville, Mundingburra and Thuringowa. These 3 seats are something of an electoral barometer for regional Queensland. If a government loses favour in these 3 districts, they're unlikely to be travelling well elsewhere in the north. It's a problem for the government that Labor holds just 8 eastern provincial seats by margins under 6%. Conversely, if we include Whitsunday, which is currently held by former LNP MP Jason Costigan, who's all but certain to lose under his new party, the LNP holds just 3 seats on margins under 6%. The point is clear. To win government on 31st of October, the LNP must make significant gains in what's always been a traditionally volatile region, the Eastern Provinces running northward from Gympie all the way to the Cape. This election, like any in Queensland, will be won in the regions, and it'll be won on the preferences of minor parties.
What do you think? It's no longer Brisbane versus the bush anymore, is it? It's quite a complicated picture. What do you think, Jen?
I don't think it's ever been Brisbane versus the bush for the major political parties. They have a very nuanced understanding of all the different electorates and communities in Queensland, and that's why you see over the 26 days of the campaign, the Premier immediately, flying to Mount Isa then Townsville, and the opposition leader going down the coast. So they do their own polling in those seats, so they have a very clear understanding of the differences. But I thought it was very valuable for Paul to point out the different segments and areas and how they vote.
Yes,
and I think particularly for people outside Queensland who find that who just have no understanding of the diversity, the breadth, the depth, the different political cultures, I think it's quite impressive. But it is really hard to provide analysis about what's going on when there is no public polling. It's so weird. But, you know, and both parties have developed very impressive databases and very nuanced understandings of key demographics. And I think, you know, their appeal is very much informed by those, isn't it? The highs vis must be resonating there somewhere, or else they wouldn't be doing it. But, you know, I think we've always said we thought women, older people in this campaign and young people are the sleeper.
Also this week, National Cabinet on Friday was cancelled at the last minute, and there's been ongoing discussions about the borders opening or closing, maybe some softening in Victoria, a new outbreak in New South Wales. But generally speaking, on the uptick as Europe, of course, gets worse and the US gets worse. So, you know, how will that affect Queensland election decisions, do we think? Will it have this impact on older voters, perhaps?
Well, Sue, you mentioned the detection of, in wastewater, of a potential case in Townsville. And that kind of coincided with the community transmission outbreak in New South Wales at about the same time that the ICAC story broke for Gladys Berejiklian. So it was like the perfect storm, really, and an opportunity for Labor to restate its credentials around managing the border. Deb Frecklington, after initially, you know, wanting the border open along with Pauline Hanson and Clive Palmer, who of course famously took it to the High Court, you know, they're in lockstep now about the borders needing to remain closed until transmission. So it's probably been, you know, a net benefit for Labor this week around that. And then the Prime Minister, you know, who although critical of that regime, you know, was in an awkward spot coordinating with his subnational counterpart.
So it sounds like Deb Frecklington has changed her mind quite a few times on the borders. Is that a reverse ferret? We go now to Dr. Elise Stevenson to explain to us what on earth is a reverse ferret.
Ever noticed politicians or the media doing a complete backflip on something they've just said? Maybe they've done so without referencing in any way that their current view is completely oppositional to their former view. Sounds like you've just witnessed a reverse ferret. The term originates in the UK from the Sun newspaper. The Sun editor, Kelvin Mackenzie, claimed that the role of journalists when it came to public figures was to metaphorically stick a ferret up their trousers. In other words, make their lives uncomfortable. When it became clear that the tide of public opinion had turned against the paper's line, Mackenzie would burst from his office shouting, "Reverse ferret! Reverse ferret!" The reverse ferret can apply equally to politics. In 2018, then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull bowed to pressure from within his own party to drop plans to include carbon emission reduction targets in the government's new energy policy. This decision to renege on a key part of the government's National Energy Guarantee, the NEG, created a furore and raised questions about Turnbull's future as a leader of the Liberal Party and of the country. Turnbull had proposed reducing carbon emissions as part of the NEG and in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. However, facing backlash from his coalition colleagues and the threat of a leadership challenge, Turnbull tried to appease critics by proposing setting emission reduction targets by regulation instead of legislation. He then went a step further a day later, announcing that the targets would be scrapped entirely from the NEG. While there's no cure for the reverse ferret, it's wise to recognise one, lest you be caught with a ferret up your leg too.
So what Paul Williams has explained to us is about the importance of multiple Queenslands, which may explain why we have such a high preponderance of smaller parties, independent parties in Queensland that have traditionally played quite a large role in some of the most recent elections. So coming to Jenny Menzies now, what do we know about the part that these minor parties can play, particularly in regional Queensland?
It's interesting because they have peaks and troughs. So they have huge peaks, and the classic one in Queensland was 98 when 11 One Nation members were elected, much to the shock of all the major parties to the Queensland Parliament. And then a couple of years later, I think they were down to one, because they were people who weren't prepared to go into government. So they kind of dropped by the wayside. And then it falls down and then it rises again. So it's based on, obviously, high levels of unemployment. It's populist movements are driven by discontent. And then people come along with simplistic answers to that discontent. And when you are disillusioned with the two major parties, it's an attractive place to park your vote. I don't think this will be a peak, this election will be a peak for those minor parties. I think the COVID issue, being in a recession, I think it might drive voters back to the major parties, because people want to be confident that there will be some competency in going forward.
Yes.
Not that they can necessarily rely on that from the majors either, but it's both Anastasia Palaszczuk and Deb Frecklington have gone very hard on I need a majority and I'm not going to do any deals, famous last words. I think the other group we need to talk about this time is the Greens, who were surging in the southeast after the council election, and we thought might be decisive in the seat of South Brisbane and McConnell and Maywar, but of course they've had their own controversy this week, with some very strange, again, backroom outbreaks of bad behaviour. So it's really, really interesting that the machine becomes the story. It's absolutely what you don't want during a campaign.
You don't want that backroom exposed quite as much as it has been. In fact, that has been the lead stories for each of the parties this week.
Yeah, it really has, really
about
bad
whether
indiscipline.
Jackie Trad would be in the cabinet or not, about whether the Greens were behaving in an unprofessional manner towards Jackie Trad.
And we talked a bit last week, didn't we, about the role, if any, that Clive Palmer would play in this campaign. And that is still really, really difficult. Beyond campaign ads, it's really hard to see what impact that's having.
And for this campaign, for some reason, we're running quite blind on the polls. Yes. Normally by now there have been a number of polls. I don't know if the polling agencies got burnt at the last federal election because they didn't end up by being very accurate, but normally by now we would have some patterns emerging about how the minor parties are doing. So we are running very blind.
But something I think it's really important for us to remember is that the Murdoch newspapers owns all of the papers and all of the media going into regional Queensland. Yes. So I think, and Sky News is going out free to air on Win. So what it looks like down here and what it looks like in parts of the rest of the state, very interesting to see. And of course, Palmer and Matt Canavan were in Clermont on the weekend, kind of beating up the discontent about mining and coal and all that sort of stuff.
And Kevin Rudd got stuck into Murdoch this week with a petition.
With the petition for the Royal Commission. I know it's all happening this week, but not in the Queensland campaign.
That's right, Anne. It's all happening in Queensland, just not in the campaign itself. But hopefully next week we'll have a little bit more inspiration in our politics up here. For all the election analysis you need for the Queensland State Election 2020, please visit queenslandvotes.com.au. And thanks for joining us.